So a few things that Scott said that I'd like to pick up on. One, your point about the challenges of the Silk Road and why, or the U.S. Silk Road policy. And I think your astute observation that a lot of Central Asians feel the benefits are theoretical and far off in the future. There's a serious framing challenge with the U.S. policy. And what I want to talk about is something that is not theoretical, that is immediately possible, and I think might resonate as a real benefit that could accrue to Central Asians today, as an alternative to the Silk Road strategy. I also want to address this idea, and I think Scott's right in the way he's framed it, of U.S. disengagement. I think this really is the sense, here in Washington at least, about the policy towards Central Asia. And it's been a policy which, a little bit more politically correct, diplomatically, has been phrased by a recent report that came out of Carnegie by Gene Rumer, Paul Stronsky, and colleagues. And I want to take a little bit of issue with this policy of disengagement, which I think is actually what the U.S. is doing right now, but again suggests that perhaps it's premature. And then I want to address your point about the view of Central Asians with associating democracy with instability, right? And so, again, a lot of what we talk about, I think, will lead into this, and it'll also lead into some of the earlier debates that we had as social scientists about transitions. So in the 1980s, 1990s in particular, when we were looking at post-Soviet Central Asia, the post-Soviet space, there was a lot of optimism about the potential for transition. And a lot of us said that this was naive optimism. I think we're in a new stage where there's a lot of pessimism about the continuity of autocracy. And what I'd like to suggest is we may be going too far in the opposite direction. I think a lot of this disengagement policy that we see with the United States is making the exact same mistake that we made in the 1990s, but in the opposite direction, right? So where we were overly optimistic in the 1990s, I think we are overly pessimistic today. So I'll try to lay out this argument, and a lot of this has to do with this idea of property rights. So international arbitration is going to come in as part of the mechanic that will get us to a hopefully more optimistic future for Central Asia. Let me begin with a little bit of micro-level data. I'm a social scientist. I like to go to the field and do a little bit of research every now and then. And so the story I'm going to tell you is the story about everything which is wrong right now with the potential for transition in Central Asia. Some of you will know this building. Some of you have probably been in this building, right? This is 107 Kievskaya in Bishkek. And it's owned by the Lizitsky family. So Natalia Lizitskaya is actually, her husband owns it, but she's the real tour de force behind this property. And the case is interesting because this is one of the only cases that I know of in Kyrgyzstan where a party, which is ultimately the state, tried to take over a property. The property owner fought it in court and won. Actually won. This is one of the only cases that I know of. And let me just a little bit of background. In 2007, the court cases began against the Lizitskys. It was a third party that brought it, but really this was Janis Bakiev, who wanted this property. If you've been here, you know this is such a plum piece of property in Bishkek. It's probably worth, I don't even want to hazard how much it's worth. It looks kind of like this today. It really hasn't seen much exterior remodeling. Natalia, who also is probably the leading budget expert in Kyrgyzstan and is employed currently by the government, fought this all the way to the end, and the end was in April 2010. And that probably gives you some indication or some understanding about why she actually won the case. So in April 2010, the Bakievs were overthrown. She went to court the next week, and the judge said, "Yo, Natalia, don't worry about it, the case has been dropped." And not only that, but the head judge apologized to her and said, "Listen, there was only so much I could do. I tried to stall the case. We try to stretch it out as long as we can, but you have to realize that I was told that there was a certain verdict that had to be delivered." And so the problem that we see in Central Asia, not just Kyrgyzstan, but throughout Central Asia, is there's no property. There's no private property whatsoever, and this poses deep, deep challenges there's no private property rights, I should say. This poses deep, deep challenges for transition. I'm going to return to that in a few more minutes. But let me just give you a couple things that I want to put on the table before we get to this central point. First, I'd like to take a look at U.S. interest in historical perspective in Central Asia to lay the grounds for why I think currently we're going in the wrong direction. Next, I want to talk about Central Asia institutional change. And assessments of Central Asian institutional change, including my own, have been very negative. And I would like to suggest there actually has been some very deep fundamental institutional change that we should pay attention to. And that actually opens up the possibility for some kind of political reform in the future. And then the last point I want to look at is this idea of tribunals and transitions, and really this idea about how external tribunals, I'm thinking about the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, say for example here in DC, or the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, where we see a lot of this litigation going on over big Central Asian assets, how these can act as vehicles for providing property rights in the absence of property rights in these countries themselves. All right. So as far as U.S. interest and historical perspective, I would direct everyone's attention to this very good study by Rumer, Sokolsky, and Stronsky that came out with Carnegie in 2016, in January 2016. And it's a good study. Actually, I think I don't know if Nava Bahar is still here. I think there was a recent event at Hopkins where people were talking past each other, and Nava Bahar said, "Well, let's take a look at what's already been said. Let's talk to one another." So I actually want to directly talk to this study that Rumer and Stronsky and Sokolsky put out, and take them in a friendly way to issue with a few of their points. But I think they get the central formulation of U.S. interests in Central Asia, at least for the 1.0, which they refer to as the 1990s, and 2.0, the aughts. I think they get it essentially right. So initially, the United States was interested in limiting the spread of nuclear weapons and political and economic reform. 1990s to 2000, yeah, that's absolutely right. And then, as we just heard from Scott, I think Roger will pick up this point, in 2001 to 2014, very much geopolitical interests were driving U.S. foreign policy towards Central Asia. Today, the policy that is being advanced by the establishment, I would put Rumer and Sokolsky and Stronsky very much in the establishment, is the following. So they suggest first that we prioritize U.S. regional engagement with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Recognize that the United States, this is second, recognize that the United States shares some interest with Russia and China and seek to harness Russia and Chinese actions to advance these interests. And third, and this is the one that I'm going to take most issue with, let demands for change be locally driven and focus U.S. reform agenda on improving social and economic conditions rather than democracy promotion. So this is essentially raising the white flag on democracy and governance efforts. And I want to question the wisdom of that advice. They say next, do not condition security cooperation on human rights and human rights performance. 5, avoid militarizing U.S. policy by overacting to the threat of Islamic extremism. Very sage advice, I would posit. And lastly, use leverage more effectively by playing harder to get and pursuing more realistic and prioritized goals. Again, I want to focus on point 3 here, which is let demands for change be locally driven and for the United States to step away from democracy promotion. I think there's a lot more that can be done, and I think there's a lot of low-lying fruit that can be accessed that we're not paying attention to. But to get to that point, let me just lay out their argument and some of the logic of their argument, which to a certain extent I agree with. First, they say efforts at democracy promotion have not been successful. And so if you're familiar with the Freedom House stuff, you're going to understand what this NFPF stands for. They say that not only has there been no progress towards regime change in Central Asia, but there's been backsliding. And if you look at the indices of, say, Freedom House, they're right. There's been no change in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan along this 7-point scale. It was not free in 1991, it's not free today. There's been no change in, well actually there's been some change in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan. It's gone from partly free, according to Freedom House, to not free. And then Kyrgyzstan, partly free. So some backsliding, otherwise no change. And I think if you look at aggregate indices and kind of just step back and you look at the big picture from 30,000 feet up, they're right. But I'd like to posit that there's actually been a fair amount of change that we would do well to pay attention to. And the first thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is that there's been fundamental institutional change in the region. And more specifically, if you look at what these countries entered into the post-Soviet period with, you had really no elections to speak of. I mean, you think the elections now are fraudulent. The elections before were even more fraudulent. And you had a single party that had complete control over the ideological space. There was no conceivable way to imagine some kind of institutionalized transfer of power outside of the Communist Party. That no longer is the case. They have elections in Central Asia. Of course they are manipulated heavily. There is opposition in Central Asia. Of course the opposition is repressed. But it's not beyond the realm of imagination to have a scenario where there's a different kind of outcome. The population and the political elite has been acculturated into this institution of elections that are well covered in the press, where you see fighting, where people actually participate in these things in some kind of meaningful way. So I would posit that's a fundamental change that, to a certain degree, U.S. and international efforts, but most of all, Central Asian efforts at political reform have brought about. And we should pay attention to that, and we should just write off the 1990s and 2000s as a failure. This is a big change. Where there hasn't been a change, however, is in this realm of private property. I would posit that for regime change, the elections, the breaking of the monopoly of an ideology, these are necessary but not sufficient conditions for political reform. Also necessary but not sufficient is the presence of private property rights. People who have private property rights have a stake in political reform. They would much prefer to have a system that is not patronage-based. They would much prefer to have a system where your access to some asset is not at the whim of an autocrat. They would much prefer to have some kind of rule of law. But we don't have this in Central Asia. Rather, what we have is patronage rule. We have the leader who distributes rents, and in return for loyalty to the leader, you get to maintain some kind of tenuous control over your asset. This is...
You're okay, that's his.
I've got 2 minutes, right?
You've got 7.
Oh, okay, 15 to 20, all right. Getting nervous for a second. So, the scenario that I'd like to put before you is, what would happen if you had both of these things? If you had both the institutional change, which I would posit that we do, and you had the property rights. Here I think you would have a much more rosy understanding of the potential for political reform in Central Asia. And I would say this is not just a theoretical example. This is an example that we see today in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the one country in Central Asia where there is some measure of property rights. If you look at litigation, international litigation, all these big assets that are being litigated in Stockholm or here in DC or Isle of Man or London, it's rarely litigation about Kazakh assets in Kazakhstan. There's a lot of Kazakhs who are part and parcel of this story, but they're litigating assets that are being taken over in Uzbekistan or in Kyrgyzstan. So you have some degree of private property rights in Kazakhstan. I would posit that you have this because the Kazakh government really doesn't have to worry about other economic actors because they are the biggest game in town, or at least until recently when oil was high, the Nazarbayev government was quite comfortable. If you're in Kyrgyzstan or if you're in Uzbekistan, you really do fear people becoming wealthy, gathering enough resources to challenge the government. In Kazakhstan, that was never a fear of the Nazarbayev government, so there was never this attack on property rights that you see in Uzbekistan, that you see in Kyrgyzstan, that you see in Tajikistan. And I've discussed this in other situations here in this room. If you look at the prospects for change with these upcoming leadership successions, so this was the question that was asked in the first panel, what does the fact that Nazarbayev and Karimov are aging out of office, what effect does this have on the future of Central Asia? I say it's a very different effect. In places where you have both institutional change that is elections, and breaking of the monopoly of the ideology, and private property, that is in a place like Kazakhstan, you can imagine a scenario where you're going to have a contested transition and real potential for political reform. In Uzbekistan, where institutional change has been minimal, property rights are non-existent, the likelihood of meaningful political reform is very low. So again, this isn't a situation where we have to, this isn't an unrealistic scenario. It's happening right before us in the Kazakh case. And I'd say we should pay particular attention to Kazakhstan, but it's not just Kazakhstan. So what I'd like to say in conclusion is, go back to that example of Natalia Lizitskaya and her ability to protect her rights in Kyrgyzstan, her property rights in Kyrgyzstan. This is the one-off example. Imagine a scenario where several very influential business people were able to defend their rights. Imagine a scenario where they could say, incorporate internationally, as we see with lots of Central Asian companies today. Or imagine a scenario where companies could take advantage of bilateral investment treaty litigation. So the BIT treaties and access to Stockholm, access to London, access to ICSID to protect their property rights. We see this actually going on right now with Kuntur in Kyrgyzstan. Imagine a scenario where we actually had wealthy individuals at the local level who had an interest in changing the system. I think we're at the early days of seeing this emerge through international arbitration, but you're beginning to see this process happen. You're beginning to see people defending their property through international arbitration, and you're beginning to see accumulation of capital among business folk at the local level, and you can imagine a scenario like we see in Kazakhstan, where the next time we have an exogenous shock, that is, Karimov dies, or another leader dies, or there's some kind of groundswell like we see in Kyrgyzstan every 5 years, that you could get political transition, or some kind of political reform. So, just to sum up, I think for a long time, academics, people like me, have been faulted for being far too optimistic about the prospects for transition in Central Asia. We're now in a period where the United States, as Scott just said, is disengaging, is walking away. And there are mechanisms out there, short of these grandiose Silk Road strategies, where the vision is distant and the benefits are not immediate. There are immediate things that the United States could do. For example, helping with this process of international arbitration, where we could see the potential for reform. We have the institutionalization of elections, we have the institutionalization of alternative ideologies. What we don't have is private property. There are ways to advance private property so as to help bring about some kind of political reform in Central Asia.